10-year-old Sam Johnson's parents always knew he would die a premature death, and when Sam took his last breath, they, with the help of a woman named Sarah, bathed his body, dressed him in his favorite baseball outfit, and placed him back in his bedroom on top of a bed of dry ice. Family and friends would spend the next 3 days with Sam's body, before finally saying goodbye. Clearly, what happened after Sam's death was not a typical American funeral. However, a new movement known as conscious dying aims to make death and the bereavement process more meaningful, and this is accomplished with the help of a death midwife, also known as a death doula. According to the October 7, 2015 Independent, a death midwife is similar to a birth midwife, but rather than focusing on new life, a death doula offers support to those preparing to leave this world by providing patient-centered and family-directed funerals. And the idea is gaining momentum. Maclean's of March 3, 2015 does note, however, that because this is a new field of practice, it's difficult to say exactly how many practicing doulas there are. But considering that in recent years we've seen an increase of death with dignity measures and open conversations about end-of-life wishes, it appears a re-energized do-it-yourself movement may be emerging. Therefore, we will first look at why death doulas are becoming more common, second, what an in-home funeral is, before turning to the implications of what some have criticized as a deeply morbid death party. The first established death doula service was started in the 1990s. The founder, Phyllis Farley, said that one day, it just hit her, that the services of a death or birth midwife are also needed at the end of life, and that life and death are two sides of the same coin. Therefore, we will first look at what a death midwife does, and second, why such services are in demand. First, a death midwife is different than a hospice worker. The aforementioned Macleans explains that they do not administer medicine or perform medical procedures, and they are not certified or licensed. Rather, a doula simply comes into a patient's life during the active phase of dying and assumes the quasi-role of a funeral director. Doulas provide services such as spiritual counseling, preparing legal paperwork, carrying out end-of-life wishes, and preparing the family for what will inevitably happen. To this end, they help equip the family with knowledge of how to care for a dead body and how to address potential complications such as decomposition. The main role of a doula, however, is to get the family back in touch with death, aid in the healing process, and remove the stigma of in-home funerals being morbid and dangerous. Ultimately, doulas aim to put intimacy back into a fundamental human experience we have made so distant. Second, the reasons individuals seek out doulas vary. The Quartz of August 7, 2015 notes that while some reasons are economic due to the high cost of funerals, most are psychological, and that many believe death in the U.S. has become less intimate and far too medicalized. The National Hospice and Palliative Care Center's poll of April 14, 2015 shows that 9 out of 10 people said they want to die in their homes, surrounded by ones that they love. However, data from the National Center for Health Statistics shows that 70% of people pass in a medicalized setting, where they are whisked off to a funeral home. In the end, those who opt for in-home funerals and death doula services want to experience death in an intimate setting and absorb the process at their own rate, rather than the distance offered by hospitals and funeral homes. Back in the Victorian era, it was traditional to pose deceased so that members of the community and family could take pictures with them. Obviously, this tradition is no longer practiced today, but it does show how far we've distanced ourselves from death. Therefore, we will first look at the history of in-home funerals, and second, answer the question on all of your minds. What happens with the body? First, until around the time of the Civil War, in-home funerals were the norm. The aforementioned Quartz explains that before the war, families washed, dressed, and prepared the corpse at home, holding funerals in their parlors, before the parlor was rebranded the living room to erase the association with death. According to the book Rest in Peace, A Cultural History of Death and the Funeral Home in 20th Century America, during the war, America witnessed a rise in embalming, as families wanted to preserve soldiers' bodies for transportation. The national tour of President Lincoln's embalmed body also assisted with the normalization of embalming and the professionalization of funeral directors. Ultimately, in years following the war, we saw a decline in in-home funerals and a widespread loss of knowledge needed to conduct one. Second, what happens with the body? For starters, a certified doctor or medical examiner must sign a death certificate. After that, the New Republic of June 24, 2015 explains that the doula teaches the family how to wash the body, which is done with warm, soapy water. After the body is bathed, the doula then instructs the family how to rinse out the mouth and shut the jaw, which is done with a small sponge soaked in mouthwash, and normally a long cloth is tied around the jaw until it sets into rigor. After the body is cleaned and dressed, Yes Magazine of August 7, 2015 explains that the doula helps the family put the body on top of a bed of dry ice and works to maintain the body for as long as the family needs. After some time, usually several days, the doula obtains a permit from the county to dispose of the body, which is usually cremated or buried in a plot of land owned by the family. We've all heard it before. Death is the second leading fear in the country, after what I'm doing right now, public speaking. However, with the rise of in-home funeral movement and death doula services, we may see a change in how we talk about and even plan our deaths. And this brings us to two important implications: the intimacy of death and tradition. First, because we don't know how to cope with death, we tend to isolate ourselves and dwell on our grief. And one death doula told the New York Times of January 23, 2015, that in doing so, we make the death more about our grief and the darkness, rather than the life of our loved ones. While some may view this sentiment as a bit crass, perhaps it's something to think about. Undoubtedly, performing an in-home funeral is much different than the detachment method traditionally performed. And during this time, we may miss out on some profound spiritual, emotional, and intimate experiences. Perhaps rather than detaching and letting the darkness so culturally embedded consume us, death doulas can guide us towards the taboo and help us view caring for our deceased not as morbid or gross, but as a final act of love. Second, in a society where death and funeral preparations are done in the shadows, death doulas are challenging tradition. The fall 2006 Journal article of American Philosophical Association argues that before World War II, most people succumbed to illness within days, and those bedridden quickly died of pneumonia. But that's not the case today. Today, we find ourselves facing a very different kind of death, a prolonged death, and subsequently, how to approach that death. The journal concludes that death is an art. And part of the difficulty of dying well in our society is that we've yet to acquire that art, yet we cling to tradition. But death doulas are offering us an alternative, albeit an older one we have long forgotten. One in which death is seen, touched, smelled, and experienced. For death doulas, dying is an interactive art. One that is profoundly beautiful. Today, we looked at what death doulas are, some applications, and some implications. Death doulas are bringing back some of history in an attempt to get our society back in touch with death in a way that we've lost. And they take their jobs very seriously, to make death as gentle and harmonious as possible.